Here we go.
Oh, you got to get off the stage. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again today. I'm your host, Jason Brand, the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And welcome back to our Freight Market Roundup. So obviously this show was punted from last week. We had our quarterly business review going on. Our production team was very busy. Let's put it that way. But I hope you enjoyed the Red Sea Crisis episode. A lot of things going on, obviously, in that part of the world, which we've been witnessing from a supply chain standpoint for years, but obviously it's been bubbling over. But if this is your first time joining us, thank you so much. This is our Freight Market Roundup. What we do on these episodes is we break down the rates our customers are currently paying for ocean freight on each of the major train lanes that we service. We also talk about some of the biggest events happening right now that are affecting our teammates and our customers. So as always, there's a lot of things to cover here. I'm not going to catch everything, but please reach out to me if you feel like I missed something big or there's something we've really got to talk about. I'll try to bring it into the following episode or maybe even do a special episode on it. So please reach out. Thank you so much. Now, before we get started, there's going to be a huge elephant in the room. And I'm sure many of you have heard the new flurry of new tariff announcements and trade deal announcements that have been happening over the past week and a half. And also some of the updates to the 232s. And we're not going to cover a single one of those today. We're going to kind of inch into a couple, but we're not going to cover them completely. And, we've been kind of trying to figure out the best and clearest way to regularly update all of you on, what's happening in the tariff world in a way that isn't knee-jerk. Because unfortunately, a lot of these announcements are knee-jerk. And, it's just, hey, tariff rates here. What's the prediction? What's the expectation? So we've been kind of trying to think about how can we take a step in, maybe a little bit late, but provide a little bit more information and have a little bit better, more complete, coverage. And so for next week, we're going to do a completely tariff-focused episode, and we're going to try to build that out as a template that we might keep forward as a second episode. We'll see for all of you on a weekly basis, where we're just kind of doing a tariff roundup. So everyone understands what's changed, any predictions we have, and things along that nature. So many customers obviously are asking about tariffs right now, but also, teammates in general, even us in the supply chain world, we can't be on Truth Social 24/7, understanding what's the latest, tariff popping off, but we have to know. So as that being said, we're at some point here, hopefully this is the start of it. It might be a little bit further down as we kind of fine tune it, but we're going to bring out a tariff roundup episode. Anyway, big, long beginning, but great way to get up-to-date information from us on a, hey, this just happened kind of way. Go to our website, scSolutionsInc.com. Sign up for our newsletter. It is very informative. You do have to prepare yourself because we break it all down there. So just make sure when you sign up, you know what you're signing up for. We don't send them that often. It's only when there is specific events. So don't expect like a regular daily. It's really only when there is something that needs to be notified for. Anyway, thanks so much. With all that, let's get this episode started. We are kicking off with our Trans-Pacific lane. So for us non-supply chain individuals out there, we are specifically talking about shipments that are leaving Southeast Asia and China and headed into the U.S. West Coast ports. Now, currently, our customers are paying, as of this week, a, quite frankly, bargain rate of $2,250 per 40-foot equivalent unit. Now, that is the lowest price we've actually seen on this lane all year. And while this lane has been anything but stable, which we've seen literally through the entire pandemic, just a violent hills and valleys situation here, we have actually seen this current very low price staying put for right around 2 weeks, which is pretty surprising. Let's move on and we'll kind of discuss maybe why here in the future. So for shippers looking for those Asian products being directed to the East and Gulf Coast ports, right now, our customers are paying an average of $3,600 per 40-foot equivalent unit. Remember, that's an average. Some of those shipments are a little bit higher, some are a little bit lower. Now, while $3,600 for a 40-foot container is not the lowest we've seen all year, this is likely going to be the price floor going forward. We're also seeing that same level of kind of eerie stability on a lane that's shown itself to be anything but stable in the past 2 years, more than 24 months, quite frankly. So if you do need to ship and you are able to ship, after these adjusted tariffs, it is a great time to book. One of the issues we're seeing pretty much across a lot of the U.S. origin shipments is a lot of blank sailings, a lot of scheduling changes. So unfortunately, schedule reliability, while in some lanes is higher, or at least high enough, you just need to prepare for things not going very smoothly, because we are seeing quite a few last minute blank sailings, changes with GRIs, and so on and so forth. Now, Trans-Pacific, let's move on. Let's go over to the transatlantic. We're going to start off with European shipments that are headed into those same East and Gulf Coast ports. Now, like we talked about on our last Freight Market Roundup, rates on this lane have officially broken below that $2,000 barrier. And quite frankly, they are also staying there. Now, this is not as low as we used to see prior to the pandemic, but this is very low by today's standards. And the real question we need to ask on why is it sitting at 1900, 1950, in some circumstances below 1900, and how soon are we going to see these rates rise again? Now, we're not going to dive into those answers quite yet, but I will here in a minute, or at least some of our predictions around that. But before we talk about that, let's quick consider those European shipments. Now, instead of going into the East and Gulf Coast ports, let's go all the way around to the West Coast ports. Now, here we're seeing a 40-foot container priced at $3,300. And it's doing the exact same thing. Actually, it's been doing it for a little bit longer. Very stable. Now, our European shipments tend to be more stable, definitely, than our Asian origin shipments, particularly over the course of this year. But for this lane, what's been fascinating is for roughly a month and a half, we've just watched this slow degradation of this lane. Roughly the price dropping $10 to $25, at least our averages, on a weekly basis. And it just keeps kind of clicking down. We're quite frankly pretty surprised. $3,300 is a great price. Now, and I'm going to quick take a step back. So we were seeing some shipments going from Europe to the East Coast as low as under 1900. What we were seeing in 2019 for that same 40-foot container, when we had steady regular volume, was around 1750. So we're getting pretty close to those old prices. And you need to consider on all of these lanes, West Coast, East Coast, specifically, we're talking about U.S. ports here, that the cost for operating at these ports has gone up dramatically since the beginning of the pandemic. We've had a series of contract negotiations, and they've been kind of, historic, each in their own right, for what these unions were able to actually acquire through these negotiations here in the U.S. at least. There's also other contract negotiations that we've discussed on this show that have not gone the way that these U.S. negotiations went. And so the cost of shipping goods is going up substantially. So when you see a price, between 2019 and 2025, that's $150 off, that is crazy. And if you just consider the environmental legislation we've got, specifically on shipments that are leaving Europe, that price difference is absolutely bonkers. I mean, I can't give you an accurate number, but I'd love to calculate one to show you really what 1750 is in today's terms as far as a cost for a 40-foot unit. Now, let's kind of dive into what's driving these weak import numbers, quite frankly, into the U.S. And, it's not going to be a surprise, especially if you've been following the show. We've been kind of talking about some of these things, but it's the tariffs, quite frankly. And it's not the tariffs themselves as much as it's the uncertainty behind the tariffs. What is the tariff going to be? When is it going to be in place? How long is it going to be in place? All of the business uncertainty behind not knowing the answers to those questions is creating an environment that originally in the year, a lot of shippers, it was, hey, let's ship everything. Hey, let's stop shipping everything. Particularly, we saw this with the quote unquote cooling off period, which we've discussed as well, which turned out to be not nearly as much of a cooling off as shippers hoped it would be, just from the tariff rate and what it was set at. But, right now, the shipping community in general, they're starting to really adopt this wait and see approach. And that's trickling down to just poor import numbers. And this is especially coming out of the medium and smaller size retailers and manufacturers. So we've had customers, this is a wild example. This is literally a one-off. We've had a customer ask us to literally pull a container off the docks at origin because just this surprise and the extent of the tariffs that were announced just made it make 0 sense importing product. And, that's obviously, as I mentioned, an extreme example, but, more frequently, what we're hearing from our customers' procurement teams is they're just holding off on placing new orders in general. They're leaning on other of their smaller manufacturers. They're kind of looking through their manufacturer base or their supplier base, and they're just finding other alternatives where they can. And sometimes giving these other manufacturers, suppliers, huge orders that they generally can't handle, but it's just kind of the way it's going right now, unfortunately. Now, the truth about all this, though, is it really is a shell game. And the only clients that are doing well at that game are the larger clients. They've already got numerous established suppliers globally. They're able to play the shell game to their advantage because they can use their volumes. They can push out these huge purchase orders and drive prices down in a way to kind of blunt the effects on the bottom line, because obviously there's a reason why companies were supplying from certain locations. And generally it comes down to quality. It comes down to schedule reliability. It comes down to cost. There's a numerous number of things. My designer colleague would come in and be like, whoa. There's a lot of more list than that. But as a logistics professional, we focus on certain things. But it's the larger companies who are really able to do this game. The smaller and medium-sized companies they're stuck. A lot of them have limited suppliers. They don't have the scale to be able to make some of these demands to protect their bottom line and continue to compete. And that's very challenging right now. But the evidence right now is it's building that U.S. consumers really haven't felt the main impact of these higher level tariffs and shipping disruptions, quite frankly, yet. And likely we're going to start seeing it in the following months. So what we've been noticing is the consumer price index has been climbing. So we saw it climbed to 2.7% in June. That was up from a 2.4% in May. In a couple of weeks here, we'll have an idea of what happened in July. And in June actually marked the highest level we've had in that index since February. And it could very well be a sign that these higher level tariffs are now just starting to be felt. But we're going to have to keep our eyes on this in the weeks and months ahead to really see if that trend continues. And if it does, it's a red flag that says, what are we doing to, slow this down? How can these companies on a company by company basis, protect themselves and protect their bottom line, and kind of build back a little bit more of, reliability in their manufacturing process. So finally, let's talk about the last lane we like to discuss in this show. And one of the last major lanes that we service on a regular basis, and that is our Southeast Asia and China to Europe shipping lane. Now, compared to all of the other lanes that we've covered on this show, there's one thing that stands out about this one. Obviously, it's not ending up in the US. And this lane is the only lane on today's episode that's actually been climbing in price. So we've watched a series of GRIs over the past couple, roughly month and a half, stick on this lane. So the current price point is at $3,300 per 40-foot equivalent unit, or FEU. And looking back just to the end of May, so a couple months back, we were seeing these prices under $1,700 per container. So why is the China-Europe trade lane so stable at the moment? Well, this lane, for one, generally has a lot more stability, just year over year, decade over decade in general. It stops off at a ton of different stops. I used to call it the dirtiest lane in the world because just the amount of ships traversing through this lane. It was a lane that, measuring carbon on from the EU became like a critical, hey, let's use this lane as an example. Obviously, we were going through the Suez back then, and it was a little bit different. But anyway, really, there's just that substantial amount of volume. And the primary driving factor right now that's actually raising this lane's price up is the huge success Chinese car manufacturers are having in Europe. And, we're going to drop a couple clips on exactly how well these companies are doing, because it's quite literally a great word for it that was in an article that came out yesterday was they are barnstorming Europe. And, despite what was looking to be a pretty tense trade talk between the EU and China, it doesn't seem like any speed bump is big enough to really slow down these Chinese EV manufacturers' expansion. And I want to quick, talk about one of the stops. Well, we've got the obviously China to Europe lane, but I quick want to talk about one of those stops I mentioned on this lane, and that's India. And the reason why I want to talk about India is because the recent Trump announcement on his social media platform, Truth, since then, carrier capacity outlooks have dramatically fallen. So I got a quote from an article I read this week that pretty perfectly describes what our team is seeing. And this is directly from a carrier, European carrier in particular, obviously ocean freight. They said there is no room to push rates any higher in the near term. And the best we can hope for right now is holding rates current rates somewhat firm. And at least we can do that for the near term. So in July, we saw significant cuts in capacity and multiple blank sailings on the India to US East Coast lane and 6 void calls across 3 India US East Coast connections. So all of that effectively helped carriers fill their vessels in the recent weeks. But when we look forward, we aren't seeing these same major scheduling changes planned for July. And this has most of us concerned because what we're seeing on the flip side, which is generally an indicator of supply, is we're watching spot rates decline rapidly. Literally over the past week since Trump's announcement, we've witnessed nearly 20 to 25% decrease in the cost of some carriers' spot rates coming from India to the US East Coast. Now, I think why this is something I wanted to bring in, especially after talking about the China going over to Europe lane, is I think it highlights that even on this area that's seeing a lot of volume passing through it, and obviously these carriers are kind of tapping into their volume allocations there to at least provide service to the US from India, you're seeing the evidence of that extreme whiplash that these tariffs are creating. And it's really hard for carriers. It's really hard for importers to navigate this market so far. And all of it seems to be spelling probably a pretty poor peak season this year. So very much appreciate everybody joining us today. We have that tariff episode next week. It's going to be the first, we're going to do a little bit of tinkering. Probably going to do no visual aids next week. But as we progress this show, I think going through a tariff roundup and having some visuals for everyone might be critical. So we'll kind of work on what that's going to look like. But we appreciate everybody for joining us. And we'll talk to you soon. Too much going on to miss a week, even every Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again. Bye.